Welcome to Come Follow Me, Week 7, which are chapters 2 Nephi 3 to 5. Chapter 3 is where Lehi addresses his last born in the wilderness. And this also happened to the Smith family because, of course, the Smiths, now that they were a bit senior, Lucy Mack at 46 and Joseph Smith Sr. at 50, had their last child in New York. And the idea of a father figure giving a last blessing to his children is something that happened in the Smiths family too, because when Alvin, who was acting as head of the household in Manchester, died suddenly, before he died, he gathered all of the children around and he gave them instructions and blessings, and he especially gave Joseph a real charge to look out for the Book of Mormon and to go through with this process. And this is what's being echoed in 2 Nephi chapter 3. Lucy Mack Smith in her history talks about how Alvin gives Joseph a charge to make sure that he obtains this record of which he's been told about, and also keep the commandments and also look out for his younger siblings. It was a harrowing time, and Joseph was particularly close to his older brother Alvin. He was like a father figure to him. So the idea that Lehi in this scenario is talking to the kids and giving them blessings, and especially Joseph, this is something that is really key to Joseph Smith himself. And as Lehi talks to Joseph about Joseph of old, he also tells him about another Joseph that will come in the future who will make this work happen. And so Joseph Smith can write himself into these scriptures by letting people know that Joseph is the Joseph of old, and he's prophesying of a new Joseph that will be called after his father Joseph that will be able to bring this work forward. Joseph Smith is writing himself into Nephi. And we see again this repetitive rhetoric which emphasizes the point again and again, and this is to focus you on Joseph as the seer, the special person that's going to come forward. And I just want to emphasize this idea in 19 and 20 of crying from the dust, which is from Isaiah, which is beginning to be used to identify this scripture, this writings of Joseph in the Americas, as another witness. Joseph Smith latches onto this idea in the dictation sequence back in Mormon chapter 8, where he's talking about Isaiah. And Mormon at this point doesn't understand or know that there's going to be Isaiah in Nephi, which is strange because, of course, he makes that possible for the replacement text to be available. And yet, in Mormon chapter 8, he doesn't know this. So again, this is another transfer and understanding about that Mosiah priority problem. For a minute about 2 Nephi chapter 3 verses 7 through to 15, because I think these are really important, because this is Joseph speaking, or Lehi retelling Joseph of Egypt's prophecy of the future. And this is huge because the books of the Old Testament, and we talk about the first 5 books of Moses, talk about Joseph as a character, not as an individual prophet, seer, and revelator that is looking forward to the future. He's part of a backstory for the children of Israel. But in 2 Nephi chapter 3, Lehi is telling us that Joseph is a real person, that he is a prophet in the past, and he's seeing into the future and revelating about Joseph Smith. We don't give this the weight that it should be given, because if you're talking about a biblical character having voice and words of his own that are backdated to before the Old Testament that we know of, this would be a huge archaeological discovery, and the text from it would make headline news across the world because it is just that big a deal. So why isn't this a big deal? Why isn't Joseph from Egypt prophesying a huge deal to the church and to archaeology and to the understanding of biblical criticism? Why is this not a big deal? The problem is that it looks like pseudepigrapha, which is somebody modern speaking in an ancient voice to give their particular words weight. And the idea that Joseph is translating this work and then having a ancient prophet Lehi reiterate an even ancient prophet Joseph talking about Joseph Smith, this is problematic. It's even more problematic because 2 years into the future, in 1831 and 1832, Joseph does a retranslation of the Bible with Sidney Rigdon, and the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis chapter 50, which includes this understanding of Joseph of Egypt, is these same passages from Nephi being put into Genesis chapter 50. And you can go read this on the church's app. This idea of pseudepigrapha in Joseph Smith's translation, Genesis chapter 50, is even more problematic because this is now based on these sections in 2 Nephi chapter 3. It's not like this is an earlier occurrence of it. These passages in the Joseph Smith translation are dependent on what happens in 2 Nephi 3 and later in 2 Nephi, and it should be an earlier occurrence. You should be able to see the dependence the other direction, and you can't, which means that Joseph is producing pseudepigrapha in the Book of Mormon, but then he's also producing pseudepigrapha in his Joseph Smith translation. And so he's rewriting the Bible to include this prophecy about himself, which he's already included in the Book of Mormon, but he's also changing it because some of the things are different than what worked out in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon says that he'll get a spokesman, but of course that doesn't work that way as the church is expanded. And in this case, Joseph Smith's translation is different because some of the things that were prophesied or envisioned in the Book of Mormon don't work out quite the way into the new church that he had imagined. So the reason that the church and certainly Mormon scholars don't highlight the idea that Joseph of Egypt's prophecies are in the Book of Mormon and then also in the Joseph Smith translation is because it looks like pseudepigrapha. It looks like Joseph Smith writing, not some ancient understanding of a previous prophet that we've had no writings of from his direct mouth before. This adds weight that it's Joseph Smith writing the Book of Mormon, not some ancient prophet. Another thing to explore when talking about these passages related to Joseph of Egypt that are in 2 Nephi chapter 3 is the understanding that Joseph Smith in the future will be given this work to do, but it's his only work to do. Verses 8 and 9 make a particular prophecy that Joseph Smith is going to do this special work to bring forward a record and to deliver the house of Israel in the Americas. But this is the only work that he's going to do. Verse 8 states that he shall do none other work save the work which I shall command him. And what's really interesting about this is it has a correlation in the Doctrine and Covenants, in Doctrine and Covenants section 5. Now, the Book of Commandments was published in 1833, and then the Doctrine and Covenants, which is based on the Book of Mormon, was published in 1835. And there were some significant differences and adjustments made to some of the commandments in the Book of Commandments that then became the Doctrine and Covenants, and this is one of them. This revelation was given in March of 1829 when the Book of Mormon production was being kicked off again after the loss of the 116 pages. The earlier iteration of this revelation says that Joseph is going to bring forth the Book of Mormon, and this is the only work that he's going to do. But of course that doesn't happen. He forms a church and he has other revelations and he brings forth other scripture, and so that doesn't equate with this particular understanding in this revelation. So it was changed in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and words were added so that the original was preserved, but the meaning was changed. And you can take this comparison table and look at it and look at the changes, and I've highlighted it in the bold what words have been added, so that now it's Joseph's first gift is the Book of Mormon, and that other gifts will be added to him. Whereas in the original revelation, this was the only gift. This is problematic for two reasons. One, of course, is that we can understand from these changes that the Book of Mormon was really a kind of a one-off. it probably started as an adventure story that Joseph was going to make some money from, but along the way it became more and more religious and then became the basis for the beginning of a church. And so that's what happened. But this also shows you that at the same time that the Book of Mormon is being written, these same words and phrases and ideas are being replicated in the Doctrine and Covenants in the same space, which also indicates that Joseph is the author of both the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants and the text of the Book of Mormon. To back up the idea that the Book of Mormon was its own singular project and not the basis of a church is the understanding that in early 1830, Joseph had a revelation to send Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Knight, Hiram Page, and Josiah Stoll to Canada to sell the international copyright for the Book of Mormon, hoping to get some money. And of course, this revelation failed because they couldn't sell it. And they came back asking why. And Joseph told them, well, some revelations are from God, and some revelations are from man, and some revelations are from the devil. And this revelation was from the devil. And of course, this was never included in the Book of Commandments or the Doctrine and Covenants because it was a failed revelation. But you can go and read it on the Joseph Smith Papers Project. Now, we've already talked about white supremacy in 1 Nephi chapter 13 and also at the beginning of 2 Nephi. But now we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty about how this is going to happen. And this happens in chapters 4 and 5 of 2 Nephi. In chapter 4, Lehi continues to bless his children, and he starts with Laman and tells him basically he's going to rebel from his brother and he's going to be cursed, and this is going to be a sore cursing, but that he's going to be preserved at the very end. In chapter 5, Laman and Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael rebel against Nephi, and they are cursed. And in 21, it's explicit that whereas they were white and fair and delightsome, so they won't be enticing to the Nephites, a skin of blackness will be put upon them, and they'll become loathsome to the Nephites. And any mixing is going to mean that this curse is going to be transferred to the children, so that it sets up the Nephites and the Lamanites as different races, and the idea that the Nephites are not to mix with the Lamanites. And the Lamanites are going to be idle people, mischief and wicked, and they're going to be a scourge to the Nephites. They're going to remind them that the Lord needs them to repent. Now, we should cross-reference this with Alma chapter 3 because exactly the same thing is said in those verses. According to this curse, that it's going to be because of the rebellion against the Nephites, and that a mark is going to be set on them, this skin curse, and it's going to come upon the Lamanites, the Lemuelites, the Ishmaelites. And this curse is so that the people won't mix, because they'll be able to tell who the good guys are because they're white and who the bad guys are because they are brown and dark and filthy and loathsome. And this is an incredibly consistent theme through the Book of Mormon, the idea that the Lamanites are brown and disgusting and dirty, and the Nephites need to save them. And when they are saved, some of those Lamanites are turned white and their skin is restored to them. And also some of the Nephites who go astray are a mark is put upon them. So this is an incredibly robust but extremely racist doctrine that is pervasive throughout the whole of the Book of Mormon. To the Book of Mormon's credit, the brown people weren't always bad and the white people weren't always good, but it presented a prevailing narrative that worked through, particularly for these colonial frontier settlers who were engaging with Native Americans, that they were wrong, they were loathsome, they could be taken advantage of and displaced and scattered because they were evil after all, and this was the lot that God had intended for them. And it set up a terrible precedent in the church going forward that brown and black people weren't good enough for certain things, and of course that they could possibly be white if they were converted, and of course because it's genetic, being brown doesn't work like that, and so they often became second-class citizens, if not completely out of the church. We now know that skin colour is related to melanin production controlled by genetics. not by curses from God. So this squarely dates the Book of Mormon to its 19th century environment. Where are the women in the Book of Mormon? They are suspiciously absent from the text, and even the most important characters just don't include the women in any measurable form. Lehi is a big character, and he just spends the last few chapters giving blessings to his children, his sons, and the sons of Ishmael. And in verse 12 of 2 Nephi chapter 4, we have the record of Lehi dying and being buried. And if you think back, we also have the case of Ishmael dying and being buried, and his daughters particularly mourning him. But we don't have Ishmael's wife dying. We don't have Sariah dying. These women are totally absent from the story. And in chapter 5, we see Nephi separating from his brothers Laban and Lemuel, and he's taking Zoram and Jacob and Joseph and Sam and also my sisters. Did you know that Nephi had sisters? Well, up until this point, neither did anybody, because they were never mentioned in the text. This is a glaring omission in the text, but it seems to be Joseph's MO, because I'm sure that you could probably name a number of Joseph's brothers, but you probably don't know the names of Joseph's sisters. And this occurs throughout the Book of Mormon because we don't know Nephi's wife's name, we don't know the daughters of Ishmael's names. Many of the characters throughout the Book of Mormon are only known by their relationship to men as daughters or wives or servants to prominent men. And despite the fact that there are a number of incidental, random men's names throughout the Book of Mormon, this is not the case with women. But it is the case with the Doctrine and Covenants. We find the same thing, lots of random men's names, very, very few women's names. This dates the text completely to the 19th century. The idea that women were not as important as men, and they certainly weren't as important in Joseph's life as contemporary, powerful people. They were subjects. The second part of 2 Nephi chapter 4 is affectionately known as Nephi's Psalm, because it really talks about his feelings about himself and his weakness and his inability and his wretched soul that he worries is in the midst of sin. It's a rare glimpse into a character which is often portrayed as being very confident and sometimes just a bit annoying. It humanizes Nephi and enables the reader to be able to really empathize with the plight of a prophet, but also a person and a man who is grappling with his own mortality and his own feelings of inadequacy. And Nephi gives an impassioned plea, which is reminiscent of James 1:5, where he says that anyone who asks of God will get liberally what he asks for. And these same sentiments are mirrored in other parts of the Book of Mormon, but it's really less personal there until later in the dictation process, where you get that first person narrative and that speaking from an I am proposition. And we also see this in Joseph's later writings about his youth and the way that he felt about growing up and feeling like he was foolish and in an error and having weakness of youth. And we see him using that same passage of James 1:5 to talk about the first vision. And so we see these same attributes of Nephi being expressed by Joseph about himself, particularly in his youth. We even see it in that earliest version of the first vision in 1832 with his history and his feelings of inadequacy and sin as a young man. And so it looks very likely that this lament of Nephi is a very similar feeling that Joseph had about himself and his inadequacies in bringing forth the Book of Mormon in his youth, surrounded by others that were more experienced, but also that he was nothing when it came to looking at God. Chapter 5 in 2 Nephi is incredible because Nephi and his brethren who follow him do an incredible amount in a very short time frame. It is the American dream in operation. Nephi is yet again accused of trying to rule over his brethren. And so things get pretty dicey. They want to kill him. And so he takes whoever will go with him and they flee into the wilderness. And this is just a few people. It's Nephi, Zoram, Sam, Jacob, Joseph, and his sisters. And they build a life together. And they're super industrious. They sow seed, they raise flocks and herds of animals. And this is a problem, of course, because this is anachronistic to American societies. They did not have domesticated animals. And also they lived the law of Moses. And of course, not only do we not have that in the Americas, but also we don't even have that in the Book of Mormon. So it's a bit problematic, but these people are doing a lot of stuff really quickly. They prosper exceedingly and they multiply in the land. And this is a real problem because population growth in the Book of Mormon, and certainly within this chapter, is phenomenal considering what population growth in an ancient setting is actually. And Nephi's taking the sword of Laban and he's using it to make other swords. And we find out in verse 15 that these are swords of steel and he's working with brass and iron and copper. And so these things are also anachronistic to the Americas. And remember, they are creating swords and their idol brethren are not doing anything. So swords would be a huge technological advancement for warfare if you had them. And they're building a temple and other buildings. This seems like a lot of infrastructure for 5 or 6 adults and their families. And Nephi is going to be their king. So the fears of the brothers were correct. He did want to rule and he is going to be the king now. And Jacob and Joseph have been consecrated priests and teachers, and they're living after the manner of happiness. And this all happens within 30 years from them leaving Jerusalem, and only maybe 10 years in them being separated from the Lamanites. And he's making plates of ore, he's got commandments to do it, and he's building the golden plates, which he's now recording all of this history on. And another anomaly in verse 34, Nephi is skipping 10 years. He's telling about wars and contentions. Now, there's only maybe 6 people who can fight from either side. This is not a war, this is a pub brawl. And the Nephites have swords, and the Lamanites are idle. They could just slaughter them. This just seems out of place, except when you're talking about an adventure story where there are multiple people that are fighting. This just is out of place for what Nephi is describing and for the amount of people who are actually there trying to make these things happen. The infrastructure you need to build buildings, to work metal, to fashion swords, these are complex things which a society needs a lot of specialized skills. It just does not seem possible with these so few people and so few people with specialized understandings. But this is Joseph's adventure story, and there are going to be these incredible things happen to these people because he's imagining a world where there is lots of adventure and lots of conflict. And we see in chapter 5 and also chapter 4 a reiteration of why these plates are necessary to capture the spiritual understanding of the people in the replacement text, as opposed to the large plates which will cover the history of the people.